May 29th, 1944, 21:13 hours, mid-Atlantic, 250 miles southwest of Madeira. Lieutenant Commander G.L. Conkey stood on the bridge of the destroyer escort USS Eugene E. Elmore, watching his sonar operator's face through the dim red light of the Combat Information Center. Below them, 700 feet down in the crushing darkness, a German submarine was trying to disappear. The hydrophone operator's voice was steady, professional, despite what had just happened. Contact bearing 275, sir. Range 1,200 yards. She's going deep. 1,200 yards. Close enough to hear the submarine's propellers through the hull, close enough to smell the fear that must be filling that steel tube beneath the waves. But U-549 wasn't running. Not yet. Her commander, Kapitänleutnant Detlev Krankenhagen, had just achieved what every U-boat captain dreamed of. 15 minutes earlier, he had slipped through the destroyer screen of Task Group 21.11 and put 2 torpedoes into the escort carrier USS Block Island. The carrier was dying now, listing heavily, her crew abandoning ship into the black Atlantic night. And Krankenhagen wasn't finished. At 20:40 hours, he had fired again. An acoustic homing torpedo, a Zaun-König, struck the destroyer escort bar near her stern, crippling her. 2 American warships destroyed in 27 minutes. It was the kind of victory that earned Knight's Crosses, the kind that got you promoted, the kind that made you believe the Führer's promises about secret weapons and final victory. But standing on Elmore's bridge, Conkey knew something that Krankenhagen did not, something that would transform this submarine's greatest triumph into its final grave. Mounted on Elmore's foredeck, just forward of the bridge, sat a weapon that looked like it had been designed by a committee of madmen. 24 spigot mortars arranged in 4 cradles, angled outward, like the spines of some mechanical hedgehog. Each mortar tube held a projectile 7.2 inches in diameter, 65 pounds of steel and Torpex explosive, contact-fused, designed to kill submarines in a way that depth charges never could. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon was called the Hedgehog, and Krankenhagen had never faced it before. Most U-boat commanders hadn't. It was new, strange, and unlike anything in the German tactical manuals. The Kriegsmarine knew about depth charges, had trained their submariners in the art of evading them for years. Sharp turns at the moment of attack, changes in speed and depth, exploiting the dead time when the attacking destroyer lost sonar contact in the final moments before the charges were released. These were survival tactics, proven through thousands of attacks, written in the blood of submariners who had failed to master them. But the Hedgehog changed everything, and the men in U-549, celebrating their victory in the cramped, diesel-stinking interior of their submarine, had no idea what was coming for them. The story of the Hedgehog begins not with naval architects or weapons designers, but with a fundamental problem that had plagued anti-submarine warfare since the First World War. Sonar, or ASDIC as the British called it, was a miracle of technology. It could detect submarines underwater, track their movements, guide attacking ships toward their targets. But sonar had a blind spot, a critical flaw that German submarine commanders had learned to exploit with deadly effectiveness. When a destroyer approached within about 200 yards of a submarine, the time it took for the sonar ping to travel through the water, reflect off the submarine's hull, and return to the attacking ship became too short for the human operator to distinguish the outgoing pulse from the returning echo. The sounds merged into what sonar operators called an instantaneous echo. In that moment, the submarine effectively became invisible. Worse, at that exact moment, when the destroyer lost sonar contact, the submarine was still too far away for depth charges to be effective. Depth charges were rolled off the stern or launched from side-mounted throwers, which meant they exploded behind or to the sides of the attacking ship, not directly ahead. By the time the destroyer reached the point where it could drop depth charges, it had been operating blind for 30 seconds or more. 30 seconds in which an experienced U-boat commander could change course, change depth, disappear into the ocean's vastness. The mathematics were brutal. Out of 5,174 British depth charge attacks during World War II, only 85.5 resulted in confirmed kills, a ratio of 60.5 to 1. You had to attack 60 submarines to kill 1. And each attack revealed your position. Each attack consumed precious depth charges. Each attack gave other submarines in the area time to reposition or escape. In the winter of 1940, a British naval officer named Commander Charles Goodev sat in an office in the Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, known throughout the Royal Navy by the affectionate nickname the Wheezers and Dodgers, and contemplated this problem. The solution, when it came to him, was elegant in its simplicity. If depth charges dropped behind the ship were ineffective because the ship had to pass over the submarine first, losing sonar contact in the process, then the answer was to throw the charges forward, ahead of the ship, while the submarine was still visible on sonar. Forward-throwing weapons weren't new. The Royal Navy had tried them before with a device called the Fairley mortar. It had failed, plagued by mechanical problems and unreliable fuses. But the principle was sound. Goodiev's team, working in collaboration with Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, a brilliant weapons designer who had developed the spigot mortar concept, began developing what would become the Hedgehog. The spigot mortar was an unusual design. Unlike conventional mortars, where the projectile contained the propellant charge, the spigot mortar's explosive charge was built into the launcher itself. A steel rod, the spigot, fitted into a hollow tail on the projectile. When fired, the propellant pushed against the projectile while the spigot held firm, launching the bomb forward. The design allowed a single launcher to fire projectiles of different sizes and weights with minimal modification. But the real innovation was in what the Hedgehog didn't do. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at a preset depth whether they hit anything or not, Hedgehog projectiles only detonated on contact. They carried contact fuses, designed to explode only when they struck something solid, something submarine-shaped. This meant that if the attack missed, the ocean remained quiet. Sonar remained effective. The attacking ship could maintain contact, reload, and attack again immediately. The first prototype was installed aboard HMS Westcott in May 1941. Tests in Liverpool Bay against a known wreck were spectacularly successful. The weapon entered production 9 months later. By mid-1942, Hedgehogs were being installed on destroyers and corvettes throughout the Royal Navy. The Americans, recognizing the weapon's potential, adopted it through reverse lend-lease. By 1943, destroyer escorts rolling off American shipyards were being fitted with Hedgehogs as standard equipment. The USS Eugene E. Elmore, commissioned in February 1944, carried a Mark 11 Hedgehog mount, 24 projectiles in a circular pattern, fired simultaneously from the foredeck. When launched, the projectiles arced through the air in a carefully calculated pattern, hitting the water in a circle 130 feet in diameter, about 200 yards ahead of the ship. Then they sank, falling through the water at 23 feet per second, 3 times faster than conventional depth charges. At 700 feet, the depth where U-549 was hiding, the projectiles would arrive in approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds in which Krankenhagen could maneuver, could try to evade, but 30 seconds was not much time when you were dealing with 24 projectiles falling in a pattern designed by mathematicians who had studied submarine dimensions, submarine maneuverability, submarine blind spots. Each Hedgehog projectile carried 35 pounds of Torpex, an explosive compound more powerful than TNT. A single direct hit was usually sufficient to kill a submarine. The projectile would punch through the pressure hull, a 3 or 4 inch hole, and water would begin flooding in at 400 gallons per minute. At 700 feet depth, where the pressure was over 300 pounds per square inch, there was no patching such a hole. No emergency blow could bring the boat up fast enough. No watertight door could hold against that pressure. The submarine would sink deeper as the flooding continued, the added weight pulling it down past its design limits, past the depth where the pressure hull could withstand the crushing force of the ocean. At some point, usually around 800 to 900 feet, the hull would implode, not gradually, but catastrophically, in a fraction of a second. The men inside would be dead before their brains could process what was happening. Conky knew all this as he watched his sonar operator track the submarine. He had drilled his crew on the Hedgehog for months, had studied the weapon's capabilities, had read the after-action reports from ships that had used it successfully. He knew that 11 of the last 16 U-boat kills by LEPT, American destroyers and destroyer escorts, had been achieved with head-throwing weapons. He knew the statistics. Hedgehog attacks were 10 times more effective than depth charge attacks. But statistics were abstractions. What mattered now was the solid sonar contact, the precise bearing and range, the knowledge that somewhere below them, 57 German sailors were about to face a weapon they had never trained to evade. "Sonar contact solid, sir," the operator reported. "Target is turning to port. Speed estimated at 4 knots. Turning to port. Krankenhagen was doing what his training had taught him, making a sharp course change at the moment he anticipated the attack. But his timing was off. He was anticipating a depth charge run, which would require the destroyer to pass directly overhead before dropping charges. He was turning at the moment he thought Elmore would be losing sonar contact. But Elmore wasn't losing contact. The submarine was still 1,200 yards away, well, far within sonar range, fully visible. "Load Hedgehog," Conky ordered. "Prepare to fire on my command." On the foredeck, the Hedgehog crew moved with practiced efficiency. 24 projectiles, each weighing 65 pounds, were loaded into their launch tubes. Safety pins were removed. The firing circuits were checked and rechecked. The entire loading process took 3 minutes. 3 minutes in which Elmore crept forward at slow speed, maintaining sonar contact, positioning herself for the attack. Below, in U-549, the hydrophone operator was listening to the approaching destroyer, trying to gauge the distance, trying to predict when the depth charges would begin falling. The sound of Elmore's propellers was growing louder, the characteristic thrum of American destroyer screws unmistakable through the submarine's hull. "Destroyer approaching, Herr Kaleu," the hydrophone operator reported, using the naval slang for Kapitänleutnant. "Range approximately 1,000 meters." Krankenhagen nodded. He had survived 14 patrols before this one. He had been depth charged more times than he could count. He knew the rhythm of a depth charge attack, knew when to turn, when to go deep, when to run silent. The destroyer would pass overhead. There would be a moment of maximum danger as the depth charges fell. Then he would turn hard, change depth, and slip away into the darkness. Standard procedure. He had done it dozens of times. What he didn't know was that the standard procedure had changed. The rules of submarine warfare, written in German blood over years of combat, had been rewritten by British engineers and American production capacity. The weapon that was about to be used against him had transformed depth charge attacks from blunt instruments into precision strikes. "Stand by for depth charges," Krankenhagen ordered. "All hands brace for impact." Throughout the submarine, men grabbed hold of pipes and valves, bracing themselves for the explosions they knew were coming. In the engine room, the diesel engineers shut down unnecessary equipment, reducing noise, reducing the submarine's acoustic signature. In the torpedo room, the torpedo men secured their weapons, ensuring nothing would break loose when the depth charges began detonating. They waited in the darkness, in the cramped steel tube that was their home and their prison, and they prepared to survive what they believed would be a conventional depth charge attack. At 21:13 hours, Elmore reached firing position. The submarine was directly ahead, range 1,100 yards, depth estimated at 700 feet. The sonar contact was solid, unwavering. Conky gave the order, "Fire Hedgehog." The launcher erupted in a sequence of sharp cracks, staggered by milliseconds to distribute the recoil stress evenly across the ship's structure. 24 projectiles launched in rapid succession, arcing through the night air, trailing smoke and fire. From the bridge, Conky watched them splash into the Atlantic in a near-perfect circle, the spray patterns visible even in the darkness. Then, silence. The projectiles were falling now, dropping through the black water at 23 feet per second, faster than depth charges, faster than the submarine could react. In the Combat Information Center, the sonar operator kept his headphones pressed tight to his ears, listening. Inside U-549, the hydrophone operator heard something that didn't make sense. He heard splashing, multiple impacts on the surface, directly above the submarine. But no explosions, no depth charges detonating, just the sound of objects entering the water and then growing louder as they sank, growing closer. "Herr Kaleu," he said, uncertain in his voice. "Multiple contacts in the water above us. No explosions. They're sinking very fast." Krankenhagen frowned. Multiple contacts? Sinking fast? That didn't match any weapon he knew about. Depth. Charges were deployed in patterns, yes, but they exploded as they sank, set to detonate at specific depths. These contacts were falling in silence. "How fast?" he asked. The hydrophone operator calculated quickly, listening to the changing pitch of the sounds as they approached. "Approximately 7 meters per second, Herr Kaleu. 3 times faster than depth charges. 3 times faster, which meant 3 times less time to evade." Krankenhagen felt the first cold touch of genuine fear. This was something new, something the tactical manuals hadn't covered, something his experience couldn't help him with. "Emergency turn to starboard," he ordered. "Increase speed to 8 knots. The submarine began to turn, its electric motors whining as they pushed the boat through the water. But a Type 9C, 40 submarine was not agile. At 700 feet depth, with the pressure hull groaning under the load, rapid maneuvers were dangerous. Turn too sharply and you might rupture a pipe, flood a compartment, lose depth control. Above, on Elmore's bridge, Conky was listening to the reports from the sonar operator. "Target is turning, sir. Increasing speed. Maintain contact," Conky ordered. "Stand by for reload." 30 seconds passed. 35. 40. Then, from the sonar operator, a different tone of voice. Sharp. Urgent. "Explosions, sir. Multiple underwater explosions." Through the hull, through the water, through 800 vertical feet of the Atlantic Ocean, the sound reached them. Not the deep, rolling boom of depth charges, but sharper, higher-pitched cracks, contact detonations. Hedgehog projectiles striking steel. 3 contacts, sir, the sonar operator confirmed. 3 hits, 3 out of 24. A 12.5% hit rate. Better than the average, but still, 3 hits. 3 holes punched through U-549's pressure hull. 3 fountains of high-pressure seawater flooding into the submarine at 400 gallons per minute, each. Inside the submarine, the world ended in an instant of shock and terror. The first projectile struck near frame 62, in the after battery compartment. It punched through the outer hull, through the ballast tanks, through the pressure hull, and detonated inside the submarine. The explosion was small compared to a depth charge, only 35 pounds of torpex, but it was inside the pressure hull, not outside. The blast wave had nowhere to go but through the submarine's interior. Men near the impact point died instantly, torn apart by shrapnel and blast overpressure. The lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on, dim red bulbs that turned the flooding compartment into a vision of hell. Water jetted through the hole in a solid column, hitting the far bulkhead with enough force to bend steel. The noise was beyond deafening, a continuous roar that made communication impossible. The second projectile hit near the stern, in the motor room. It punched through the propeller, shaft housing, and exploded among the electrical motors that powered the submarine when submerged. Arcing electricity lit up the flooding compartment in stuttering blue-white flashes. The motors seized, their shafts bent by the explosion. U-549 lost propulsion. The third projectile hit the worst place possible, the control room. It came through the hull at a shallow angle, punched through the diving plane hydraulic system, through the ballast tank controls, through the trim tank manifolds, and exploded near the main ballast blow valves. The submarine's depth control systems were destroyed in a fraction of a second. Krankenhagen, thrown against the periscope housing by the force of the explosions, pulled himself upright and tried to assess the damage. But there was nothing to assess. The submarine was dying. Water was flooding into 3 compartments simultaneously. The motors were destroyed. Depth control was impossible. The submarine was sinking, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "All compartments report," he shouted over the roar of flooding water. The reports came back through voice tubes, through runners stumbling through the tilting submarine, through men screaming to be heard over the noise of rushing water. After battery compartment flooding, abandon the compartment. Motor room flooding, watertight doors sealed. Control room flooding, attempting damage control. But damage control was impossible. You cannot patch a 4-inch hole in a submarine's pressure hull at 700 feet depth. The water pressure was too great, the flow too powerful. The best they could hope for was to slow the flooding, to give themselves a few more minutes of life before the inevitable. "Blow all ballast tanks," Krankenhagen ordered. It was the last resort, the emergency procedure that would either bring them to the surface or leave them without the air pressure they needed to control their descent. The chief engineer pulled the emergency blow levers. Compressed air roared into the ballast tanks, expelling seawater, creating buoyancy. For a moment, the submarine's descent slowed. The depth gauge needle quivered, paused, then began moving again, downward. They were still sinking. The flooding was too extensive. The weight of water pouring into the submarine was greater than the buoyancy they could generate. The mathematics of death were implacable. 800 feet, the depth gauge operator called out, his voice cracking. 850, 900, 900 feet, 200 feet beyond the submarine's rated test depth. The pressure hull was groaning now, a continuous metallic shriek that grew louder with every passing second. Rivets were popping, welded seams were cracking. The steel plates that formed the hull were beginning to deform under pressure that exceeded their design limits. At 900 feet, the pressure was 400 pounds per square inch. At 1,000 feet, it would be 435. Somewhere between those two numbers was the point where U-549's hull would fail catastrophically. 950 feet, the depth gauge operator whispered. He was crying now, openly, the tears streaming down his face mixing with the salt water spray that filled the control room. Krankenhagen stood at his post, one hand gripping the periscope housing to steady himself against the submarine's downward angle. He thought about his crew, 57 men who had trusted him to bring them home. He thought about the tactical manuals that had promised them they could evade depth charges if they were skilled and lucky. He thought about the weapon that had killed them, a weapon he had never heard of, never trained to counter. He thought about how the war had changed while they weren't looking, how German submarines that had once been hunters had become prey, how every advantage they had once possessed had been eroded by Allied technology, Allied production capacity, Allied determination to win the Battle of the Atlantic at any cost. And then, at 973 feet, the pressure hull failed. The implosion was instantaneous. The steel plates that formed the hull crumpled inward like paper. The air inside the submarine compressed to a fraction of its original volume in a microsecond, generating temperatures over 1,000 degrees. Every man inside died before his nervous system could transmit the signals that would have told his brain he was dying. The submarine continued to sink, no longer a vessel but wreckage, tumbling end over end into the abyss. It would come to rest on the sea floor, 3 miles down, where the pressure was over 6,000 pounds per square inch. A grave that would never be disturbed, never be recovered, never be found. Above, aboard USS Elmore, the sonar operator listened to the death throes of U-549. "Heavy underwater sounds, sir," he reported, breaking up noises. "Target's gone." Conky nodded. He had heard it too. Through the hull, through the water. The sound of a submarine dying. It was not a sound that brought satisfaction, despite the fact that the submarine had just sunk an American carrier and damaged another American ship. It was just the sound of men dying, far from home, in a war they were losing. "Secure from general quarters," Conky ordered. "Continue the search pattern for 15 minutes, then proceed to assist Bar." The Hedgehog had performed exactly as designed. 3 hits out of 24 projectiles. A confirmed kill. 1 more U-boat that would never return to port, never sink another Allied ship, never threaten another convoy. The weapon that German submarine commanders had never expected was proving to be exactly what the Allies had hoped for, a revolution in anti-submarine warfare. But the story of the Hedgehog was not just about technical specifications and kill ratios. It was about something deeper, something that spoke to the fundamental nature of the war in the Atlantic. It was about the moment when German submariners began to realize that the tactical doctrines they had been taught, the skills they had mastered, the experience they had accumulated through years of combat, were no longer sufficient to keep them alive. The Hedgehog represented a shift in the balance of technological power, but more than that, it represented the application of industrial and intellectual resources that Germany could not match. The weapon had been conceived by British engineers, refined through months of testing, mass-produced in American factories, and deployed across hundreds of ships in a matter of months. It was the product of an open society that encouraged innovation, rewarded creative thinking, and could mobilize resources on a scale that authoritarian regimes could not match. For the men of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat service, the Hedgehog was one more nail in the coffin of their hopes for victory. One more piece of evidence that they were fighting a war they could not win, against enemies whose industrial and technological capabilities exceeded anything their leadership had prepared them for. And the Hedgehog was just one weapon among many. Centimetric radar that could detect a surfaced submarine from 25 miles away, high-frequency direction finding that could locate a U-boat the moment it transmitted a radio message, long-range aircraft that could patrol for hours over the Atlantic, escort carriers that provided air cover for convoys thousands of miles from land, improved sonar that could track submarines to unprecedented depths, and behind all of it, the massive industrial capacity of the United States, building ships faster than Germany could sink them, producing weapons faster than Germany could counter them. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. From the beginning of 1943 onward, U-boat losses accelerated. In May 1943, 41 U-boats were sunk, more than one, per day. The exchange rate had become unsustainable. Each U-boat lost represented 40 to 50 trained submariners killed, men who could not be replaced quickly enough. The training pipeline was breaking down under the pressure of mounting casualties. By mid-1944, when U-549 encountered the Hedgehog for the first and last time, German submarine operations had shifted from aggressive hunting to desperate survival. The wolf packs that had once terrorized Allied convoys were being hunted themselves, picked off one by destroyer escorts equipped with weapons like the Hedgehog. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, had promised his submariners that new technologies would restore their advantage. Acoustic torpedoes that could home in on propeller noise, snorkel systems that allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, new submarine designs with improved underwater speed and endurance. These promises kept morale barely functional, kept submariners going out on patrol, despite the mounting evidence that they were unlikely to return. But promises could not change the fundamental mathematics of industrial warfare. Germany was producing approximately 20 U-boats per month. The Allies were sinking them faster than they could be replaced. By the summer of 1944, the U-boat force was shrinking despite continued production. Each patrol reduced the number of experienced commanders, making subsequent patrols more dangerous, as inexperienced officers made fatal mistakes. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crew by 1944 was 4 months from the day they left port to the day they died in the Atlantic. 4 months to live, 4 months to contribute to a war effort that was visibly, measurably failing. The men knew it, even if they didn't speak about it openly. They could see it in the empty berths at the submarine pens, in the missing faces at the officers' mess, in the lengthening casualty lists that were posted and quickly removed. And still they went to sea, because they were naval officers, because they had their orders, because to refuse would be desertion, because some still believed in the cause they were fighting for, because others simply couldn't imagine doing anything else. For the crews of Allied destroyer escorts, the Hedgehog represented something different. It represented hope that they could win the Battle of the Atlantic, that they could protect the convoys that kept Britain fed and supplied, that they could reduce the casualty rate among merchant sailors who were dying by the thousands on ships torpedoed in the mid-Atlantic. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The weapon had its critics initially. Many Royal Navy captains preferred the familiar depth charge, with its satisfying boom and visible water column when it exploded. The Hedgehogs' silent misses were psychologically unsatisfying, even though the weapon's contact detonation meant that any explosion was a confirmed kill. Some commanders thought the weapon too complex, too prone to mechanical failure, too dependent on precise sonar information. These critics were proven wrong by combat experience. By mid-1944, ships equipped with Hedgehogs were achieving kill rates 10 times higher than ships using only depth charges. The weapon had been refined, improved, integrated into combat information centers where all tactical information flowed through a single command point. Sonar operators became skilled at providing the precise targeting data the Hedgehog needed. Fire control teams learned to maintain the weapon in all weather conditions, to load and fire quickly enough to make multiple attacks before a submarine could escape. The most famous Hedgehog success story came from the Pacific Theatre, where the destroyer escort USS England sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days during May 1944. 6 submarines, 6 Hedgehog attacks, 6 confirmed kills. It was a performance that captured headlines, earned the ship's commanding officer a Navy Cross, and provided definitive proof that the weapon worked exactly as advertised. But for every successful attack, like England's rampage through the Japanese submarine scouting line, there were dozens of quieter kills like U-549. Submarines caught by destroyer escorts in the middle of the night, attacked with Hedgehogs, sent to the bottom with all hands lost. These kills didn't make headlines, didn't earn fame for the attacking ships, but they added up, accumulating into a death toll that the Kriegsmarine could not sustain. By the end of the war, Hedgehog and similar ahead-throwing weapons had accounted for a significant percentage of U-boat kills. The exact numbers varied depending on how kills were attributed. Ships often used both Hedgehogs and depth charges in the Levanter, same attack, but the weapon's effectiveness was undeniable. It had transformed anti-submarine warfare from a game of chance into a process of systematic elimination. The technical specifications of the Hedgehog tell only part of the story. 24 projectiles, 130-foot circular pattern, 7.2-inch diameter, 65-pound weight, 35-pound Torpex charge, contact fuse, 23 feet per second sink rate. These are numbers, cold and precise. They don't capture what it meant to be in a submarine when those projectiles hit, to hear them sinking through the water above you, to know that if even one struck your hull, you were dead. They don't capture what it meant to be on the attacking ship, watching the projectiles arc through the air, waiting for the underwater explosions that meant you had killed 50 men who had names, families, hopes, dreams. Men who were your enemies but were still men, who died drowning in darkness or crushed by pressure, or burned by the flash of explosions inside their submarine. War is not abstractions and statistics. War is men dying in horrible ways for causes they may or may not believe in. War is weapons designed with precision and used with cold efficiency to achieve maximum lethality. War is the Hedgehog, a brilliantly designed instrument of death, doing exactly what it was built to do. And for the men of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat service, the Hedgehog represented the moment when they realized that the sea had become their grave, that the weapons they faced had evolved beyond their ability to counter them, that the war they had been sent to fight was already lost. The destruction of U-549 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that was repeating itself across the Atlantic and Pacific theatres with increasing frequency as 1944 progressed. Every week brought new reports of U-boats lost, often with all hands, often to weapons their crews had never encountered before. In the Pacific, where Japanese submarines faced many of the same challenges as their German counterparts, the Hedgehog was achieving even more spectacular results. The story of USS England would become the single most remarkable anti-submarine warfare achievement of the entire war, a 12-day rampage through Japanese submarine defences that would demonstrate the Hedgehog's true potential when wielded by a skilled and determined crew. The USS England was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, commissioned in December 1943. She displaced 1,673 tons, carried a crew of 15 officers and 198 enlisted men, and was armed with 3 3-inch guns, torpedoes, depth charges, and 1 Mark 10 Hedgehog mount. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, a capable officer but not a charismatic leader. The soul of the ship, the officer who would transform England into a submarine killing machine, was her executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson. Williamson was obsessed with anti-submarine warfare. He drilled his crew relentlessly on the Hedgehog, studying the mathematics of submarine hunting, calculating firing solutions, training his sonar operators to provide the precise data the weapon needed to be effective. While other destroyer escort crews viewed the Hedgehog with skepticism, Williamson believed in it with an almost religious fervour. He had studied the weapon's performance in the Atlantic, had read every after-action report he could obtain, had analysed the kill ratios and understood what they meant. The Hedgehog, when used properly, was not just better than depth charges, it was 10 times better. But to use it properly required skill, precision, and absolute confidence in the weapon's capabilities. In mid-May 1944, American codebreakers at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific intercepted and decoded a message from Japanese submarine I-16. The submarine was a departing truck, carrying 75-pound bags of rice to resupply Japanese troops at Buin on the southern tip of Bougainville Island. The intelligence was detailed, specific, actionable. Task group was formed to intercept USS England, USS George, and USS Raby, 3 destroyer escorts that had been conducting routine convoy escort duties in the Solomon Islands. The interception occurred on May 19th. An Allied patrol aircraft spotted I-16 on the surface and radioed its position. The 3 destroyer escorts formed a line-abreast sonar sweep and began their search. At 13:35, England made sonar contact. Lieutenant Williamson was at the Combat Information Centre, listening to his sonar operator's reports, calculating firing solutions in his head. I-16 was a veteran submarine. She had completed 9 war patrols, had survived numerous depth charge attacks. Her commander knew all the evasion tactics. When England began her attack runs, I-16 responded, with radical manoeuvring, sharp turns, sudden changes in depth, the full repertoire of submarine survival techniques that Japanese submariners had developed through 3 years of war. The first Hedgehog attack missed. All 24 projectiles splashed into the water, sank through the depths, and found nothing. Silent misses. The second attack scored 1 hit. A single projectile struck the submarine's hull at 130 feet depth. The explosion was muffled by the water, barely audible aboard England, but the submarine survived. 1 hit wasn't enough. The third attack missed because Williamson's depth estimate was wrong. He had assumed the submarine was at 200 feet. The fathometer, checked after the attack, showed I-16 was actually at 325 feet, far deeper than anticipated. The projectiles had passed over the submarine without making contact. The fourth attack was evaded. I-16's commander, Lieutenant Commander Takeuchi Yoshitaka, had timed his maneuvers perfectly, turning at the exact moment the hedgehogs were fired, presenting the narrowest possible target profile as the projectiles fell. But submarine evasion consumes resources: battery power, compressed air, the mental stamina of the crew. By the fifth attack, I-16 was running low on all three. Williamson recalculated his firing solution, adjusted for the submarine's depth, predicted where she would be when the projectiles arrived. At 14:33, England fired her fifth Hedgehog attack, 4 to 6 detonations, multiple hits, all within seconds of each other. The explosions merged into a single massive underwater blast that lifted England's fantail out of the water and knocked men off their feet. 20 minutes later, debris began floating to the surface. Oil, wood, personal effects, the detritus of a submarine that had ceased to exist. The following day, a 3-mile by 6-mile oil slick marked the location where I-16 and her crew of 65 men had died. The rice they were carrying would never reach the starving garrison at Buin. The submarine that had survived 9 patrols had been destroyed on her 10th. But American codebreakers weren't finished. On May 20th, they decoded another message. This one revealed Japanese plans for a submarine trap north of the Admiralty Islands, a picket line of 7 submarines positioned to intercept American aircraft carriers. The submarines were RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-109, RO-112, and RO-116, all from the Japanese 7th Submarine Squadron. The picket line was positioned across a route that Admiral William Halsey had used twice before when moving carrier task forces. The Japanese were betting that he would use it a third time, and they would be waiting. What they didn't know was that American intelligence had read their orders, knew their positions, and had decided to roll up the entire picket line from one end to the other using 3 destroyer escorts equipped with Hedgehogs. On the night of May 22nd, USS George detected RO-106 on radar. The submarine was running on the surface, recharging batteries, when George's searchlight illuminated it at 3,550 yards. The submarine crash-dived immediately, but it was too late. England had sonar contact. George made the first attack at 04:15. All 24 Hedgehogs missed. England took over at 04:25. The first attack missed. The second attack, fired at 05:01, scored at least 3 hits. The submarine's hull ruptured in multiple places. Water flooded in. RO-106 sank with all 49 hands. The 3 destroyer escorts continued their search, sweeping up the picket line. On May 23rd, they found RO-104. This time, both Raby and George attempted attacks first. Raby fired 4 Hedgehog attacks, beginning at 06:17, all missed. George tried at 07:17. Miss. Then 4 more attacks between 07:30 and 08:10. All misses. 12 Hedgehog attacks by 2 different ships, and the submarine was still alive, still evading. The attacks were consuming time, burning fuel, using up Hedgehog projectiles. Commander Hamilton Haynes, the escort division commander aboard George, was growing frustrated. His ships had fired 384 Hedgehog projectiles and achieved exactly 0 hits. Then England took over. Lieutenant Williamson had been listening to the sonar reports from the other ships, analysing RO-104's evasion patterns, calculating where the submarine would be based on battery consumption, air reserves, the psychological state of a crew that had been under attack for over 2 hours. At 08:34, England fired 10 to 12 detonations, multiple direct hits. The sounds of the submarine breaking up were audible through England's hull. A large underwater explosion followed 3 minutes later as RO-104's batteries short-circuited and detonated. Debris and oil appeared on the surface at 10:45. 3 submarines down. 4 to go. On May 24th, George detected RO-116 on radar at 0120. England made sonar contact at 0150 and fired at 0214, 3 to 5 detonations. The submarine's hull was breached, but the major explosion that had characterized previous kills didn't occur. The submarine simply sank, flooding gradually, its crew drowning in the darkness as the boat descended past its crush depth. A small quantity of oil and debris appeared after sunrise at 0702. By the following day, the oil slick had expanded to cover several square miles, marking the grave of RO-116 and her 56 crew members. 4 submarines sunk in 5 days. It was an unprecedented achievement, a performance that was attracting attention from higher command. But England wasn't finished. On May 26th, a hunter-killer group consisting of escort carrier USS Hoggett Bay and 4 Fletcher-class destroyers arrived to assist. England and her 2 consorts were ordered to return to Manus for resupply. On the way back, they encountered RO-108. The submarine was running on the surface at night when England's radar detected it. The engagement that followed was brief and violent. RO-108 submerged immediately, but England's sonar operator held contact. Lieutenant Williamson manoeuvred his ship into firing position and launched a Hedgehog attack at 23:23 hours. Only 12 projectiles, half a salvo, because the ship was running low on ammunition. It was enough. A series of muffled blasts from 250 feet down signaled the destruction of RO-108 and the 58 men who died with her. 5 submarines in 7 days. The England, George, and Raby returned to Manus, resupplied with Hedgehog projectiles, fuel, and provisions, and sailed back out to finish the job. 2 submarines from the original picket line, RO-109 and RO-112, had returned to port earlier, leaving only RO-105 still on station. But RO-105 had a new mission now. Her orders had changed from detecting American carriers to evading American destroyer escorts that were systematically destroying the 7th Submarine Squadron. Her commander knew that 5 of his sister boats had been sunk in a week. He knew that the Americans were hunting with some new weapon that his crew didn't know how to counter. He knew that his submarine was probably next. For 25 hours, RO-105 evaded detection, using every trick in the book, running silent, lying on the bottom, minimal movements. Maximum stealth. But American sonar technology in 1944 was sophisticated enough to detect even a silent submarine if you knew where to look and had the patience to search methodically. The hunter-killer group found her. For the next 30 hours, they attacked relentlessly. Over 20 Hedgehog attacks were launched by various ships in the group, all missed. RO-105's commander was skilled, experienced, and desperately lucky. He evaded attack after attack, each time by the narrowest of margins, each time burning a little more battery power, using a little more compressed air, pushing his crew a little closer to the edge of exhaustion and panic. By the evening of May 26th, the submarine's batteries were nearly depleted. The air inside was foul, heavy with carbon dioxide. The crew was on the edge of collapse. The commander knew he would have to surface soon or die from asphyxiation. He began maneuvering toward the surface, planning to surface between 2 American ships, where their overlapping fields of fire would protect his submarine long enough to recharge batteries and replenish air. At 22:03, RO-105 broke the surface between USS George and USS Raby. The 2 destroyer escorts saw the submarine simultaneously and turned toward it, but they were positioned such that firing at the submarine would have meant firing toward each other. For a few precious seconds, RO-105 was safe. Then the submarine submerged again, hoping to have gained enough air to continue evading. But Commander Haynes had had enough. Despite his previous orders that England should hold back and let other ships get credit for kills, he radioed, "Oh hell, go ahead, England." Lieutenant Williamson brought his ship into position. At 07:36 on May 27th, England fired what would be her final Hedgehog attack of the patrol. 6 to 10 detonations. A major explosion followed at 07:41. Oil and debris fountained to the surface. 6 submarines in 12 days. It was a feat that had never been accomplished before and would never be matched again. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, sent a message to England. There'll always be an expeditionary England in the United States Navy. Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, the official naval historian, would later write that no other anti-submarine warfare performance in World War II came close to England's achievement. But the victory came with a cost that wasn't measured in American casualties. On board England, after the destruction of R01-04, a young seaman had approached Lieutenant Williamson and asked how many men had been on that submarine and how he felt about killing them. Williamson had replied that there were 40 to 80 men aboard, and that war was kill or be killed. But later, sitting in the wardroom with his coffee, Williamson found that the taste wasn't as good as he expected. He had just killed perhaps 60 men who had families, who had hoped to survive the war, who had died in terror and darkness as their submarine flooded and sank. The mathematics of anti-submarine warfare were clean and simple. 6 submarines sunk, 0 friendly casualties. A perfect tactical performance. But the human cost was more complex. The destruction of the 7th Submarine Squadron's picket line had strategic consequences that rippled across the Pacific. On June 15th, Admiral Soemu Toyoda sent orders to Admiral Takeo Takagi, commander of the 6th Fleet, to move Squadron 7 immediately to positions east of Saipan. American forces were invading the Mariana Islands, and Toyoda needed every available submarine to attack the invasion fleet. Admiral Takagi's response was brief and devastating. Squadron 7 has no submarines. The entire squadron, 7 boats and approximately 400 men, had been destroyed or recalled. 6 of those 7 had been sunk by Hedgehog attacks. 5 of the 6 had been sunk by a single destroyer escort in less than 2 weeks. The strategic implications were immense. Without submarine reconnaissance, Toyoda couldn't determine the size and composition of American invasion forces. Without submarines to attack, transports and carriers, he couldn't inflict the casualties that might force the Americans to delay or abandon their offensive. The invasion of the Marianas proceeded with minimal submarine interference. Saipan fell in July. Tinian and Guam followed. These islands would become the bases from which B-29 bombers would eventually reach the Japanese home islands, including the aircraft that would drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The strategic chain of causation was long and complex, but it began with 24 Hedgehog projectiles fired from the foredeck of a destroyer escort in the Pacific. The statistical analysis of Hedgehog effectiveness told a story that submarine commanders on both sides were beginning to understand by mid-1944. British figures from the Battle of the Atlantic showed that out of 51 74 depth charge attacks, there were 85.5 confirmed kills, a ratio of 60.5 to 1. You had to attack 60 submarines with depth charges to sink one. In comparison, Hedgehog attacks during the same period showed 268 attacks for 47 kills, a ratio of 5.7 to 1. The Hedgehog was more than 10 times as effective as depth charges, but raw statistics didn't capture the psychological dimension of this disparity. Depth charge attacks were terrifying for submarine crews, but they were survivable. Experienced commanders knew the evasion techniques, knew how to exploit the moment when the attacking ship lost sonar contact, knew that if they could survive the first attack, subsequent attacks would be less accurate as the water churned by exploding charges created false sonar echoes. Hedgehog attacks were different. They were surgical, precise. If the attack was well executed, there was no evasion. The projectiles fell in a pattern calculated to cover the submarine's maximum possible displacement during the time it took for them to reach target depth. A submarine could maneuver, but it couldn't maneuver out of a 130-foot diameter circle in the 3 seconds it took for hedgehogs to fall from the surface to 300 feet depth. And if even one projectile hit, the submarine was probably doomed. The contact fuse ensured that all the explosive force was delivered directly to the pressure hull. A 4-inch hole at 300 feet depth meant 400 gallons of water per minute flooding in. Emergency blow systems couldn't compensate for that rate of flooding. Watertight doors couldn't seal against that pressure. The submarine would sink deeper as flooding continued, past its test depth, past the point where the pressure hull could withstand the external pressure. And then it would implode, a catastrophic structural failure that occurred in a fraction of a second, killing everyone inside before their brains could process what was happening. For submarine crews who survived Hedgehog attacks and lived to tell about it, the experience was distinctive and terrifying in ways that depth charge attacks weren't. Depth charges announced themselves. You heard the destroyer passing overhead, heard the splash as charges entered the water, heard them sinking, counting down the seconds until detonation. The explosions were massive, violent, but they were explosions you could hear coming. Hedgehogs were silent until the moment of impact. You heard the splashing as projectiles entered the water, heard them sinking faster than depth charges, 3 times faster, giving you 1/3 the warning time. And then either silence, meaning the attack had missed and would be followed immediately by another attack, or the sharp crack of a contact detonation followed instantaneously by flooding, darkness, death. The silence of a Hedgehog miss was psychologically devastating for submarine crews in a way that depth charge explosions weren't. When depth charges exploded without hitting, at least you knew the attack was over. The attacking ship would have to reload, reposition, search for you again in the churned water. You had time to maneuver, time to go deep or shallow, time to change course. When Hedgehogs missed, the silence meant the attacking ship still had perfect sonar contact. Another attack was coming in minutes, not hours. The attacking ship didn't need to pass over you and lose contact. It could fire from ahead, maintaining contact throughout the attack, reloading in 3 minutes and attacking again. The psychological pressure was cumulative. First attack, miss, silence. Second attack, miss, silence. Third attack, fourth, fifth. Each time the projectiles fell, each time the crew waited in terror for the impact that would kill them, each time the silence that followed was both relief and renewed dread because another attack was coming, and probability said that eventually one would hit. Lieutenant Hans Müller was a German U-boat officer who survived a Hedgehog attack in the North Atlantic in August 1944. His submarine, U-241, was depth-charged first, a conventional attack that damaged the boat's diving planes and ruptured several air tanks. The submarine surfaced, attempting to make a run on its diesel engines. That's when the Hedgehog attack came. Müller described it years later in a memoir that was never widely published, an account of those few seconds that shaped the rest of his life. "We heard the splashing," he wrote. 24 distinct splashes, very close together. The captain ordered an emergency dive, but the planes were jammed. We couldn't submerge. The projectiles fell around us. I could see them hitting the water, small splashes like someone throwing stones into a pond. Harmless looking, deceptive. They sank so fast, faster than depth charges, much faster. The captain was screaming orders, but there was nothing to do. We were a surface target, and the projectiles were already falling past our hull. I counted 4 seconds, from splash to impact. 4 seconds. That's how deep we were, maybe 30 feet, and the projectiles were falling past us at 7 meters per second. 3 missed ahead, 3 missed astern, 1 missed to port, 17 missed to starboard. I know this because I was at the hydrophone station, and I heard each one strike the water and sink past. Each one was a death that didn't happen. 23 deaths that didn't happen. The 24th hit. U-241 survived that hit. The projectile struck the outer hull, but failed to penetrate the pressure hull, a 1 in a million lucky break that no one could explain. The submarine limped back to port and was decommissioned. Mueller survived the war but never went to sea again. The memory of 24 projectiles falling and the 4-second wait for death was sufficient for one lifetime. But most submarines hit by hedgehogs weren't lucky. Most sank with all hands, leaving nothing but oil slicks and debris fields to mark where they had died. The hedgehog's kill rate among submarines it hit was effectively 100%. If the projectile penetrated the pressure hull, the submarine was finished. No amount of damage control could save it. This certainty changed the psychological calculus of submarine warfare. In the early war years, submarine commanders had been willing to accept high-risk missions because they believed survival was possible if they were skilled and lucky. By late 1944, with hedgehogs becoming standard equipment on Allied anti-submarine vessels, that calculation had changed. Skill and luck weren't sufficient anymore. The weapon was too effective, too precise, too deadly. The impact on German U-boat operations was measurable. In May 1943, before hedgehogs were widely deployed, 41 U-boats were sunk. In May 1944, after hedgehogs had become common, only 5 U-boats were sunk. But that wasn't because the hedgehog was less effective. It was because far fewer U-boats were putting to sea. Admiral Dönitz had withdrawn most of his submarines from the North Atlantic in May 1943, acknowledging that Allied anti-submarine capabilities had made offensive operations unsustainable. By mid-1944, U-boats were operating primarily in coastal waters, where the shallow depths and complex underwater terrain made hedgehog attacks less effective. The deep ocean, where submarines had once been hunters, had become a death trap. Every U-boat commander knew that venturing into the North Atlantic meant facing destroyer escorts equipped with centimetric radar, improved sonar, and hedgehogs. The mathematical probability of survival had dropped below acceptable levels. You might survive 1 patrol, maybe 2. By the 3rd, the odds had caught up with most crews. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crew by late 1944 was still 4 months, but that average was skewed by submarines that never encountered Allied anti-submarine forces. For boats that did encounter destroyer escorts, the life expectancy was measured in minutes. The technological evolution that the hedgehog represented was part of a larger pattern in World War II, a pattern where Allied industrial and intellectual resources were applied to specific tactical problems with devastating effect. The hedgehog hadn't been designed in isolation. It was the product of a system that encouraged innovation, tested new weapons rigorously, and deployed them rapidly once they proved effective. The British Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, the Wheezers and Dodgers, was an organisation that brought together engineers, naval officers, and weapons designers to solve tactical problems that conventional military thinking had failed to address. The Hedgehog was one of many innovations that emerged from this organisation, alongside limpet mines, shaped charges, and other specialised weapons. The American adoption of the Hedgehog through reverse lend-lease was equally significant. The United States could have attempted to develop its own forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon, wasting years in parallel development. Instead, American naval officials recognized that the British design was effective, arranged to manufacture it under license, and began fitting it to destroyer escorts rolling off American shipyards within months. By 1944, American factories were producing Hedgehog launchers and projectiles by the hundreds. Every new destroyer escort was fitted with a Hedgehog mount as standard equipment. Existing destroyers were retrofitted when they returned to port for maintenance. The weapon that had been an experimental prototype in 1941 had become ubiquitous by 1944. This rapid deployment was possible because of industrial capacity and organizational flexibility that authoritarian regimes couldn't match. Germany had brilliant engineers and innovative weapons designers. But the Nazi system was rigid, hierarchical, resistant to bottom-up innovation. Ideas had to flow through official channels, be approved by politically reliable officials, conform to ideological requirements. The Allied system was messier, more chaotic, but ultimately more effective. Engineers could propose radical ideas without fear of political consequences. Naval officers could criticize weapons that didn't work without being accused of defeatism. Feedback from combat operations was incorporated quickly into weapon designs and training procedures. The Hedgehog's evolution from prototype to standard equipment took less than 3 years. A comparable German weapon development program might have taken 5 years or more, assuming it wasn't cancelled for political reasons. This difference in development time, multiplied across hundreds of weapons systems, created a technological gap that widened throughout the war. By 1944, Allied anti-submarine vessels had better radar, better sonar, better weapons, better training, and better tactical doctrine than their German counterparts. They also had more ships. The United States alone commissioned 463 destroyer escorts during World War II, vessels specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. Germany never developed an equivalent specialized anti-submarine vessel class. The cumulative effect of these advantages was overwhelming. German U-boats that had been effective hunters in 1940 through 1942 had become hunted prey by 1944. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Germany had been winning in 1942, was decisively lost by mid-1943. The Hedgehog was one weapon among many that contributed to this victory, but its psychological impact on submarine crews was disproportionate to its numbers. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now. And don't forget to subscribe.